Welcome to another episode of the Breakdown. And at first, a bit of a first for us. We're doing a throwback fact check kind of thing. For those of you who follow the show regularly, you know that last weekend we had us, I believe it was July 21st, we had this conversation with harm reduction and recovery addict. And I want to be really, really clear that it's both of those things for Guy Felicella, because he really does believe in the full continuity. And we also had on that same panel conversation, a conversation with Adam Zivo, who is a writer and has some very strongly opposing views to guys. And it was a fascinating little conversation. But one of the things that we promised coming out of that conversation is we were going to have a follow-up chat. We were going to try to find somebody qualified, and we were going to have a follow-up chat where we're actually going to do fact-checking for reals, fact-checking, because we don't want to just have on people who have opposing opinions. We want to have people who know the things. And oh my gosh, the guest that we have tonight, I'm just going to say you should Google his name and go read his University of Calgary profile, because that's what I've been requested to leave it at. So very excited to welcome to the program, Dr. Monty Ghosh. Dr. Ghosh, thank you so much for having us on today.
Thanks for having me, Nate.
I soft pedaled the introduction as you requested, because Dr. Ghosh does a lot of street level, I'll say, frontline medicine in the addictions universe. So if I can get you to give sort of your introduction before we get into the nuts and bolts of what do we get right, what do we get wrong on last Sunday.
Yeah, sure. So I'm an addiction physician, and I work in both Calgary and Edmonton, and I go back and forth in the province, and I work with what I call equity deserving populations. And so people sort of on the margins of our society, and that's who I serve. Those are the people that I stick close to, and I'm a huge believer in both harm reduction and recovery as an addiction physician. And so in terms of harm reduction work that I do, I help evaluate this program called the National Overdose Response Service, which is operated out of Ontario. It's a phone line, a virtual supervised consumption service on your phone, so that people who are using drugs alone in their own homes don't have to use alone. And so that's one service that I'm a part of. But yeah, very much believe in this whole continuum of care between recovery and harm reduction. I know it's a very contentious issue in our province right now, but truth be told, I don't think it needs to be. And I think that there's room for both. And it's trying to find the middle ground on a lot of these situations. And that's the gist that I got actually as well from the debate between Adam and Guy, that they both really care about this issue, and they both really care about this population, and they have two different approaches to the problem, and two different opposing viewpoints at times, but there is some consensus there as well, which I was really glad, Nate, that you pointed out in the very beginning. You had those 9 points that you walked through, and they converged on all of them, which is great. And so yeah, and happy to talk about the Alberta dynamic as well, of course, as we are both in Alberta here. But sometimes the policy, we kind of have to move on things that we have opportunities to move on, and sometimes we can't on others. And of course we'll dive into that, of course, in our conversation. But maybe I'll park it at that. How does that sound, Nate? And we can get moving.
That was a very, very good introduction. I have to say, for the record, because I want to emphasize the emphasis that you have on the folks that you're trying to treat. The reason why I didn't go through the whole list of all of the things was because you wanted to make sure that there were no barriers to entry for the people that you treat, no intimidation or anything like that. And I bring that up not because I'm trying to embarrass you, but because I think that that's a really important part of the conversation. And this is one of the things that I struggle with some of the positions that Adam was advocating for, is because it seems like a lot of the controls that some people are advocating for when it comes to a safer supply are actually creating more barriers to entry. I'll get your thoughts on that, but let's talk about last Sunday's show. So, broad strokes, how'd we do? I mean, I was actually quite pleased that I got both of them to agree on the 9. There were a couple where I was like, I don't know how this is gonna go, but what was your sense of the conversation? Was there anything that was glaringly that made you go, "Whoa, that's not okay"?
No, there wasn't, to be honest with you. I mean, I think Adam has his point of views, and Guy, of course, as well. And Guy is incredibly gracious. Guy has so much lived experience. Guy is a personal friend, and I want to people to like know to know that as well. So I have my own personal biases around Guy. And I admire the man tremendously, and he's taught me a lot. Now, with Adam, you could tell that Adam is very passionate about the situation. And I can also see from Adam that he cares about this population deeply, to the point that he's willing to go on the attack about what he believes in. I do think that when I read some of Adam's work, sometimes it feels a bit sensationalist. But watching him talk and watching him speak and articulate his thoughts was very impressive, and he did a great job of not bringing that into the conversation, and trying to stick to the facts. Now, I will contend some of the facts, and we'll talk about those in a sec. But he's not necessarily wrong. It's how you interpret the facts. And I think that's sort of the gist of it, is that how you interpret the evidence, it really dictates how how the conversation rolls. Um, so we can kind of go through those step by step, but also kind of talk in general about things. And I don't think Adam's necessarily wrong in what he believes in either. There's a lot of points that he brought up that are worth discussing and worth evaluating. And I hear a lot of Adam's concerns echo through a lot of the physician population. On the flip side of things, I also hear a lot of things that Guy talked about as being echoed from people with lived experience, people who are using substances on the streets, and harm reduction advocates too. I'll go out by stating right now that at this point in time, I don't have a set stance on safe supply. I'm trying to learn about it just as much as everyone else is. So I try to stay neutral on the topic and try to learn as much as possible. I do believe that there's a space for safe supply ultimately, but it depends on how we do it. And I think and Adam kind of touched on that as well. And so I think that's very important to highlight too. And we can kind of travel along those lines as well in terms of what could be potentially available in Alberta in the future around the safe supply piece, because I do think that we need to have an alternative to the current toxic drug supply.
Yeah, and I think that this is, that was part of the nuance that I was trying to pull out of the conversation, and I talked about it a bit at the beginning with the whole "we're here just to talk about opiates," because I think that there is my personal feeling is that there is definitely a space for a safer supply strategy in regards to particularly the opiates, because it's the opiates that kill people. I mean, people who are overdosing on what I would colloquially refer to as sympathomimetics, but for everybody else, that's the cocaine, the crack, the methamphetamines, all of that kind of stuff. Um, they're going to have a very bad day if they overdose, but the likelihood of death is significantly less than the likelihood of death if from somebody overdosing from an opiate. Am I safe with that statement?
I agree. Yeah, absolutely. Especially if we're looking at the street stuff.
Okay. So right out of the gates, I think that there is, there's certainly subsets of the safer supply realm who say, no, it should be all drugs, everybody should be able to get drugs. And that's sort of the extreme end of things. And I can appreciate some of the arguments that get thrown in there, because I can go to a liquor store and buy really, really watered down beer, or I can buy like 100 proof. So there's some analogous arguments to be made, but the to me the priority in the conversation needs to be the opiates, because that's what people are dying from. So what was your takeaways? Were there any factual mistakes made in that conversation in regards to opioids?
Yes and no, for sure.
Okay.
And I wonder, like, the way that I went through this was I watched the podcast, the YouTube video back to back several times over, and went through chronologically to see and fact check some things that were being said. And there is an ounce of truth to all of this, just so you're aware. But again, it kind of depends on how you interpret things, or which the ways that you use data. So maybe do you want to start doing that? Like, maybe let's take 10
Yeah,
minutes,
let's
just
get
kind
right
of
into
focus
it.
on that. And then, sure. So I mean, the one thing, and Guy, as I said, is a personal friend. The one thing that Guy said right in the beginning, which I was like, okay, got to fact check this because I wasn't sure myself. But turned out to be not entirely true, was that he was talking about how for a lot of people who start on opioids, one of the main reasons they start on it is because of other things like alcohol and marijuana. He talked about the trauma piece, which is huge. And that guy's absolutely true about the trauma piece, as was Adam. And I think you guys brought into the discussion about how we need to treat that trauma piece for sure if we're going to have mandated treatment, which we'll talk about later on. But he's absolutely true about the trauma piece and adverse childhood experiences that predisposes you to having any sort of addiction later on down the line. But in terms of starting opioids in particular, it was really hard for me to find the particular reasons to why people go on to opioids. And I had to look through the literature and the data. And the truth be told, there's very limited data, up-to-date data on this as a whole. Now, the stuff that I could find was from SAMHSA, which is an organization in the States dedicated to substance use and mental health, as well as a couple other studies from the States that were looking more along the lines of the heroin situation. And what they found essentially was that, according to SAMHSA, about 66% of people who started heroin started because they had a prescription opioid in the beginning that was given to them or that they obtained. And then there was another study that was done looking at youth and urban injection drug users interviewed between 2008 and 2009, again, showing how old this data is. And they found that 86% of them had used opiate pain relievers non-medically prior to using heroin. And their initiation was usually because of obtaining opiates from family, friends, or personal prescriptions. And so again, this is very old data. Does it really apply to our current context of safe supply? Yes and no, right? It gives us some information, but no one's really looked into this as of yet. And so that's an important area that we need to look into in the future. When we're looking into people who are on current street supply of fentanyl, it might be important to ask that question again. And there is these national surveys that are out there from the BC CDC, Ontario does their own. So it might be important to sort of re-examine, especially in the context of safe supply, why people are on this medication, especially new users.
I want
And I
to
call them medication substances, I should say. Yeah.
Yeah. I want to just explore that a little bit because there's two pieces that I think are fascinating about that. I mean, there is this perception, and I think this was one of the things that may have been said in the conversation of, a kid goes to a party and somebody's like, "Here, take this, it's safe." I don't know. I can't say that I've encountered, at least in my limited experience, a whole lot of people using opioids at parties because things like ecstasy, other stimulants, they predispose people to I want to party all night. Opioids tend to predispose people to naps. So it's not really a party drug per se. But the other thing that's fascinating about that number that you included in there is all of those numbers predate safer supply programs in Canada. And 86% of youth are saying, "Well, I stole prescription opioids from somebody else, and that's how I got started." So again, I just wanted to take a sec to highlight the diversion argument is not new. It is a something that I suspect will largely coexist for as long as as long as people are using drugs, people are going to find ways to use drugs. But I interrupted you, so please continue.
No. You're absolutely right. Right, Nate, you're absolutely right. The diversion argument is always going to be there, and that is the crux of the issue. I think that's the issue we hear from the Alberta government. That's the issue we hear from police officers, some police officers. It's the issue that we hear from Adam, is the diversion issue, and that's the crux of it. And I think, and we will dive again. We can dive into that right now too. It's where that's where the hard line is with the Conservative government, is that they're worried about the level of diversion that occurs, but we haven't measured the level of diversion, and it's hard to measure. It's not easy to figure out. And we have anecdotal stories, and I'll tell you this much: I've seen people who have done supremely well with safe supply, both in Alberta with one person who does have that injunction. That individual has done incredibly well with her safe supply. There's people I've heard from Ontario and Vancouver who have done well with their safe supply. Now, on the flip side of things, I've met people coming in to Alberta from BC who have received safe supply but don't use their safe supply. And they're asking to go on to opiate agonist treatment. And when I talk to them about why they're not using their safe supply and what they do with it, they flat out tell me that they sell it off. And why do they sell it off? because they need the money. They can't survive. They're on the streets. They purchase fentanyl because the safe supply doesn't even touch what they're using. It doesn't help them out at all with the withdrawal symptoms or the cravings, and they have difficulties with safe supply. So they need fentanyl. We're in a new era of substance use in which the potency of the drugs are so high that it can't be touched with the hydromorphine that's being provided to them. I've seen on the other side of things as well with some of our clinics, I've seen patients who were only methamphetamine users, and they have moved on to opioids because someone gave them really, really cheap uh, um, dilaudid, essentially. And it's a game that's being played with them. So to frame that a bit more, I've worked in some corrections facilities as well, virtually. And one of the things that some of the corrections individuals have told me, that people who are in the corrections and who are also using substances themselves, is that they use it as an upsell. So what they'll do is they'll get people hooked onto free Dilaudid, and who are only on crystal meth, for example. They'll get them hooked on it, then they'll upsell them to fentanyl, or give them fentanyl thereafter once they're hooked on it, and then they'll start charging them for the fentanyl, which is much more expensive than prescription opioids, and so it puts these individuals into even more poverty, unfortunately. So they're being targeted, for example. Now, so like I'm trying to say here is that I've heard both sides and I've seen both sides, and what we need to know is who will safe supply work for and who will it not work for. And maybe there's a better model of safe supply that we can examine in the future. And Adam did touch on that. Adam actually touched on something that I think is reasonable. Is do we need to provide people with fentanyl safe supply? Is that the thing that we need to go down? And is
You,
that the
you
path that?
anticipated my next question there.
Okay,
Because
let's hear the question.
I wanted to jump in with that. I mean, it seems like we're treating the wrong thing with the wrong thing when we're treating people who are addicted to fentanyl with hydromorphone. And I think it's really important to be clear. Fentanyl, in and of itself, I mean, one of the things that is repeated often is the poison is in the quality of the drug and the dose of the drug. And fentanyl is on the daily administered safely in a variety of medical situations. So it's not that fentanyl is like the dark lord of the Sith or something and it's going to come and destroy you immediately. That's not what it is. It's when it is abused and upsold, that's when it can get really, 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 and arguably used over a long period of time and inappropriately. That's when it can get really, really problematic. But one of the other things that I just wanted to highlight of what you were saying there before it got lost, because we're going to cover so much ground, is I think that do you think, I'll ask you because you're the expert, do you think that part of the safer supply conversation has to include, it turns out there's some drug dealers that are terrible people and predatory, and maybe we should have some mechanisms in place for that?
100%. Absolutely. And I think there's a lot of advantage being taken of for this population with the safe supply piece for sure.
Okay. So please continue now that I've went down a
Yeah.
rabbit hole.
No, and to that point, and I hear stories from like Sharon Koivu, for example, that Adam's spoken about, where she talks about a lot of her clients are being preyed upon for their safe supply, that they're being forced to give up their safe supply to organized crime rings. Now, does this mean that we should be providing safe supply? I don't know if that's necessarily the truth, but maybe we need to have, as you said, mechanisms in place to protect those individuals and figure out ways to best manage this. And so for the safe supply piece, like fentanyl might be the way to go. Now, you as a clinician, myself as a clinician, giving out and doling out fentanyl might be very difficult to do, and it is a very controlled substance. It can be very potent. If I get exposed to fentanyl somehow by accident, I could definitely die in an instant. I would definitely overdose. And so we might need to have a mechanism in place to control that. And I think Adam did talk about that piece as well. And I don't think Guy's actually posted when I have private conversations with Guy on this as well. But if we were to provide fentanyl to individuals, prescription grade fentanyl, whether that's sufentanil, whether that's another form of fentanyl. And fentanyl is very expensive, by the way, in its pure form, its pharmaceutical form. We might have to do it in a controlled setting. And so that would be in an observed setting. So they would come in, get their fentanyl dosing, and then they would leave. And what we would need to do though is we would need to create as much access as possible for this population because we don't want to create more barriers for them either. So this means having fentanyl available at supervised consumption sites, having fentanyl available at clinics and pharmacies, having and using new novel forms of technology so we can observe people to have it if we need to, that's so that they're doing okay. We want to make sure that they're safe as well with their fentanyl. We don't want them to overdose and they have nobody there to support them and resuscitate them. So like these are the things that we need to do. We need to figure out a way to provide them with the appropriate safe supply, but also in a mechanism that is available for them, doesn't put more barriers for them to access. But at the same time, we need to also have some safeguards, safe rails, if you may, in place so that, I mean, if it does get diverted, if it does get in the hands of an animal, for example, by accident, that animal doesn't overdose. It's much easier with dilaudid for sure. Again, fentanyl can be, and I hate saying this, but I've heard it from others. It can be weaponized potentially. Not that it would be, but it's a dangerous substance, and we have to be very careful with how we do it. And I think that's the wave of the future. I think that's the way we need to kind of move with the safe supply argument. We need to find an alternative to this drug supply, but it might have to be in a controlled setting. And I think that's the way we can move forward with Recovery Alberta. I do think that there's a place for safe supply here in the form of fentanyl, and if the government's main concern is diversion, maybe you can still move forward with that. But we have to sort of do it in a way that is readily accessible for the population.
Yeah, again, that barriers to entry piece. I'm curious. I know how much, and again, full disclosure. I mean, we're getting way more in the weeds on my experience than I try to on the show. But I know that the fentanyl that I carry as a paramedic working on the streets in Calgary is cheaper than a drink at a bar. The vials that I carry, I think, are like $1.90. And and so like I know that there are certainly fentanyl patches and certainly other formulations of fentanyl. I know like they make the fentanyl lollipops that they use in the military as well, and those are crazy expensive, which is why we don't get to have them. But in the clinical area that I operate in, just to be clear. But um, you know, I want to talk about what the barriers of entry could look like, because I know that there's some people who are going to say, well, if we're going to have people coming into supervised consumption sites, and if we're going to be providing them with commercial grade fentanyl or other safer supply drugs, well, we got to get their Alberta healthcare card, we got to get their ID, we got to get their all of their things. And my immediate reaction to that is kind of like, okay, what about the folks what don't have that? And second of all, there's going to be a lot of people who are going to be terrified of that. So how do you address that kind of thing? How would you envision that kind of thing playing out?
It's a good question. So, I mean, I don't think especially for just regular supervised consumption, that we need to keep track of people's IDs. I don't think that's necessary. I think that is another barrier. That being said, from when this has been brought up with the government, it's been the situation that they don't expect everyone to have ID all the time, but they want people to get access to ID eventually, which I can come on board with because ID is such an important part of what we do. And so, and it's a huge part of our work because it gives them access to other resources they may not otherwise have outside of supervised consumption. But to use it as a tool to monitor and for surveillance, I don't know if that's the right way to go.
Okay.
So that's one of my concerns. But again, ID is a good thing to have in general, but for surveillance, maybe not so much so. Now, and I don't know where I stand on this just yet. I've heard numerous arguments about access to safe supply and supervised consumption sites. And some of the things that I've heard, for example, is that, do we as healthcare professionals need to pay for it? Do we need or healthcare providers of the healthcare system, I should say, pay for the safe supply for people to use? Or do we actually allow the people who are using substances to purchase it at fair market value? Like, what is the way to go with that? A way to reconcile this, for instance, which I've heard being touted by others, is that maybe if it's being used as just pure safe supply as harm reduction, maybe the client needs to purchase it at fair market value. But if it's being used for treatment, If it's being used in conjunction with OAT and with an access to recovery eventually, then that should be provided for free as a part of the healthcare system. So like really interesting thoughts and ideas as to how to approach this. And of course, if we approach one way or the other, it needs to be looked at and evaluated, and we need to examine it very closely. But very, very intriguing thoughts and ideas. And so if we were to provide, say, fentanyl supervised consumption sites, and if it's going to be paired up with OAT, for example, opioid agonist treatments like methadone, buprenorphine, maybe it is it should be provided for by the public healthcare system.
Is there an argument to be made? We're going to go down all the rabbit holes today. I apologize.
Yeah.
Is there an argument to be made, though, I wonder, if the safer supply is being provided through a clinical setting like a supervised consumption site? Um, I mean, the diversion rates that come when I say diversion, I'm not talking about diversion to like, oh, the drugs go on the streets. I'm talking about the people go in the treatment. The diversion rates for supervised consumption sites are actually pretty respectable. And so is there an argument to be made that if you're giving somebody a smaller dose of pharmaceutical fentanyl, that dollar of cost is worth the investment in building the relationships and having the appropriate staff there to build the relationships so that you can keep this person from overdosing to the point where, when they're in that place where they're able to go, yeah, I'd like a break, or yeah, I'd like to access treatment, they're alive to do it.
I completely agree with you. I think that there could be a value, very much value in that, and that should not be a dollar cost. So now I was under the assumption, because I was told that the fentanyl cost of fentanyl was very expensive from others who were trying to look at this, but you might be right. It might be a lot cheaper. But regardless of the cost of it, if the benefit is the relationship being built and the eventual support that they get and access to housing, income support, mental health supports, trauma therapy, if it develops that relationship and gets them drawn in, that's that's what we need. And in reality, I mean, that's kind of the secret sauce of all of these programs, to be honest with you, whether it's supervised consumption sites, whether it's IOT programs, whether it's the safer supply programs. Because when I look at the data again around safer supply, a lot of it is that relationship building that happens. And so I think that's the key here. That's sort of the secret sauce.
Okay, you had a list that you were looking down at. I want to let you get to your next point
Yeah,
before
yeah,
we
no
get
worries.
distracted
Yeah,
again.
like oh, and apologies. So, like one of the things that Adam mentioned about was that there was a direct correlation between abundance of substances and perceptions of safety and the harms that occur with substances, especially with youth. And so there's that is a yes and no. So he's kind of right, but he's also kind of wrong. And so we have this thing called the public health U curve around substances. And so it's a giant U curve. On the y-axis, it's harms, societal and health harms, and on the x-axis, it kind of goes from a completely unregulated criminal market all the way to an unregulated legal market on the other side. And it's a giant U. So if we were to completely legalize fentanyl and have it unregulated, there will be a huge amount of harms to society. And if we completely criminalize it and it's also unregulated, that can also cause problems as well, equal amounts of problems, if you may. The happy middle point, the very bottom of that U curve, is a highly regulated legal market. And I think that's where safe supply could be in the future. So really it's about having access to a regulated supply, highly regulated supply, but have a lot of fail safes around it as well to make sure that there's no or limits of diversion. Because we do know that if you start to go along up that U curve where things are getting a bit more unregulated, that there's a risk of diversion. That could be problematic too, but then we have to weigh that against other risks as well. Like, will people not be able to access their safe supply then if we have too many constrictions around it, or restrictions, I should say? Will that be a barrier? Will that cause even more problems for these individuals? Like, it's hard to say where we land with this until we try. But that there is that happy bottom of the U curve. And so the thought that having an overabundance of substance could be a problem, not necessarily, again, if it's really, really regulated. And perceptions of safety, potentially, yes, that could be a problem. But, I don't know if that's necessarily the case here. So Adam was right in some respects. But that's not the full truth here. And
Is
and so yeah.
is it safe to say, like, I want to get a clearer idea of what you mean by highly regulated, because uh, I can see a bunch of different ways that term could be interpreted, and the whole purpose of this episode is try to nail down as much stuff as we can. But do you think there's also it's safe to say that if you were to say, let's go for the bowl of porridge that's just right, which is the highly regulated market, is it problematic is the word I'll use, uh, to look at the extremes. Like if you focus only on to me, the conversation should be, yeah, if you go to the extremes, everything gets really bad really quickly. So let's not do that. Let's go to let's go to the good bowl of porridge, because the other two are too hot and too cold. Let's go for the nice one. Um, is that would you like to see? Here's the question I want to ask. Took me a second to get there. Would you like to see more messaging and more conversations around the idea of how we get to the good bowl of porridge, as opposed to everybody focusing so much on the bad bowls of porridge and losing their minds all the time?
100%. Absolutely. That's the key here. And to answer your other question, what's the level of regulation? I have no idea. I don't think any of us do right now. We don't know what's the right level of regulation. But that's what we need to look into. That's your question. Yeah, that is exactly your question. Like we need to focus on what is the right level of regulation for safe supply. What are the right amounts of guardrails we need to have around it, so that we're both supportive of this population, but also not causing more problems.
Perfect. Thank you, sir. Your next point.
Yeah, sure. We'll keep moving down the line. So another thing that was brought up was that was the youth piece, and Adam had brought up that there's potentially a lag period in terms of what we're seeing with the data and safe supply with youth, and so Adam pointed out that there was some concerns with the data there, that even though there was a decrease overall in mortality related to youth secondary to opioids, that there was just a lag in data, and that we were not being fully disclosing the numbers. I was trying to look through this as well, and Adam pointed out some key numbers. So in 2017 there was 0 deaths, 2018 there was 0 deaths, 2020 there was 5.5% of increased mortality from opioids. In 2021, it was 22%, I believe, or I don't know if it's 2023. I can't remember now. But there was these numbers that he pointed out, and I did find those numbers. I did find them in the literature. So Adam was right on that. But the one thing that when you break the numbers down a bit more, there's just so low in general that it's hard to say it's a population impact. So for example, there was 0 deaths. Sorry, I should say, sorry, there was in 2023, 2024. I have to double check this again. Actually, no, I take that back. Sorry. If you don't mind me pulling up my notes right now, I'm just going to take a
Yeah,
quick
please.
look.
No, by all means.
So it says here that there's 126 unregulated youth drug toxicity deaths reported in BC between 2019 and 2023. Of these, there were 0 deaths in which toxicological analysis detected only hydromorphone, but hydromorphone was detected in 16 individuals, 13% of them. So that's a pretty low number overall. And so there was only 1 death in 2020. There was 3 in 2021, and there was 8 in 2022, and there was 4 in 2023. So when you look at percentages, it's a high increase for sure, but as whole numbers and on a population level, that's nothing. That's not really much. Not to say that those youths don't matter, and not to say that that hydromorphone might not have contributed to their deaths, because it does state here that there was hydromorphone in their systems. So in 11 of the 16 youth deaths, 69% had hydromorphone. However, it was below the therapeutic range, and it was unlikely to contribute significantly to their deaths. 4 of the deaths had a concentration of hydromorphone that was above the therapeutic range, and for 1 death, the concentration could not be measured due to the degradation of the sample. And in 12 of the 16 youth deaths, 75% did have fentanyl or fentanyl analogs in their system as well.
Okay.
So all very interesting. So again, on a population level, it's hard to say. Is it concerning still? Yes. Is there a potential for youth getting diverted hydromorphone? Absolutely. Have I anecdotally heard this from other physicians and physician colleagues in both British Columbia and in Ontario? Yes, I have. I've heard these stories from physicians that I trust, that I respect, that they have concerns about this. But is it causing population level issues? No. But that still means that we need to address it somehow or the other. And what's the proper way of addressing it? And do we accept that there could be potential harms from safe supply as well?
I guess
We
the
don't,
counter,
it's hard to say.
yeah, I guess the counter question is if we're talking about kids who, you highlighted at the beginning, the trauma piece is huge, 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 huge contributory factor for kids accessing drugs as a coping mechanism or escape route or. If we're talking about kids who are going to be accessing opioids, it seems to me, and this is where I'm hoping you tell me if I'm right or wrong, it seems to me that we're talking about a population who is already predisposed to pursuing some form of chemical vacation. And I'm not trying to be dismissive when I use that. I'm just making up terminology as I go. But if we're talking about people who, because of reasons, whatever those reasons may be, are pursuing the use of some form of pharmaceutical, I guess my question is, okay, well, if we have the choice between them using um, a opioid that is commercial grade and not cut with metformin, a diabetic medication. It, that was for the audience, not for you, obviously. Yeah, or if we have a choice between those two things, and this kid is likely to use drugs anyways because they have trauma that is unresolved and untreated and not being managed, what would we rather have them use? I mean, my reaction is I would rather have them use the commercial stuff. So even if there is some diversion of hydromorphone to that population, I have a really hard time not looking at the alternative and going, good.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. I'd rather not have them use illicit fentanyl and have them use hydromorphone. I mean, and again, I don't have a proper scope necessarily on this because I don't see this in Alberta, and I have yet to see a child who's been sold hydromorphone. I'll tell you that much on my end. But the stories that I hear from colleagues is that they are being targeted by drug dealers, that the youth are being targeted with prescription opioids, with the potential and an opportunity to upgrade them to fentanyl because they can milk more money out of them in the future. So again, I have not personally seen any youth getting diverted hydromorphone, getting hooked onto opioids because of hydromorphone. I have yet to see that myself personally, but these are the stories that I hear. And is there an ounce of truth to that? I don't know. Right. And is it something that we should be worried about? I think it's something we need to consider for
For sure.
sure.
For sure.
And
Um,
pay attention to the arguments, right, on both sides.
well, I mean, the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence, and vice versa. So, i- is it possible that there is some diversion of safer supply drugs to youth? Of course, it is. I think that there is anecdotal and actual evidence for that happening across the country. But again, I find myself going like, okay,
Yeah.
like,
Well, and the thing is, like, how do we mitigate that then? Like,
yeah,
does it doesn't necessarily mean we stop safe supply? It has to mean that we might have to do something else around it. So whether this is like, having greater enforcement around drug dealers who are distributing safe supply, and hopefully, like, and the other thing too is, I mean, this is a very complicated situation because some of these people who are distributing drugs are people who are using substances themselves and are highly vulnerable themselves. Those aren't necessarily the people we should be targeting. Some of the people that we should be targeting are more organized structural crime individuals who are not using substances, are not addicted, are taking advantage of this population, making millions and millions of dollars off of our folks. I mean, that's a concern. Uh, One of the things, we're kind of moving forward that Adam did talk about, and I need to investigate this further because I couldn't find any evidence of this, but it's totally feasible and possible, is that he was talking about pill mills existing in Ontario, and that these pharmacies were using safe supply as a sort of not a funding mechanism, but a moneymaker. And there's an ounce of truth to that we've seen with prescription opioids in the past. We've seen that with methadone and Suboxone as well. That we often do see that a lot of pharmacies make a lot of money off of the daily dispensing of these medications. And so he did point that out. So that is also something that I just didn't see any evidence of, but it's feasible, it's possible, and also something like that also needs to be regulated and looked at. So that, because we don't want to take advantage of this population other means as well, right? By making a profit off of them. So that also needs to be examined. So I mean, he had some really reasonable points that he talked about in that regard. One of the things that I was not too sure about was his discussion in terms of whether or not all of the diversion that was occurring that they were catching in BC from the police were confiscating the seizures were related to safe supply or not. He gave some interesting stats in terms of how many people have chronic pain concerns are on opioids versus how many people have opioid use disorder on prescribed alternatives or safe supply. And was like ultimately from what I could see in the literature, the research, talking to others about this in preparation for this, is that it's really, really hard to say whether it comes from prescribed alternatives or safe supply, or whether it's actually coming from people who have chronic pain concerns, all this diversion of pills. Now, that being said, it probably is likely it's coming from both, to be honest. And to what level and quantity, it's hard to say. Is it something we need to keep track of and find out a better way to determine? Absolutely. So I think we can't conclusively state one way or the other that all these drug seizures are coming from diverted safe supply. But is it something we need to look into? Absolutely. We need to definitely look into it and examine, and then also examine why is that happening. And again, it comes to the point: do we have the right form of safe supply, or do we need to look at an alternative format? Um, One of the other things that I think everyone agreed upon in the discussion was that we need to have wraparound services around these safer supply programs, and if that's not there, it needs to be implemented. So Adam was pointing to some things about certain programs in Ontario that he believed were not doing this. Uh, Maybe he might be right on that. If they aren't doing this, they need to be doing it. I have no idea. I don't have any clue as to whether or not that's happening in all of these safe supply settings or not. The ones that are quite frequently touted, such as Andrew Serrata's program in Ontario, as well as some of the safer supply programs out of Crosstown in BC and Vancouver, they do have wraparound services associated with their safer supply, which might be again the key ingredient to keeping people in support, in treatment, and getting them to proper housing, etc. So, I mean, if that is not happening, that needs to be part of it. So that means that we need to have some regulation around safer supply. So if people are going to be doing safer supply, they have to have these wraparound services associated with them. And then Adam went beyond that to a certain extent that he didn't really have a chance to fully talk about. But he talked about some of the advocacy work that's being done by some of the people who are not really for safe supply, and some of the points that he had brought up and some of the points that I looked into were actually reasonably valid, to be honest with you. So one of them was whether or not people should be getting liquid hydromorphone instead of pill form of hydromorphone because of the potential issues associated with the pill form. And I think that's actually pretty reasonable. We don't want to, as you had pointed out as well, Nate, we don't want people injecting forms that are potentially problematic. And so if we want to provide them with appropriate, safer supply, we need to be providing them with a format that's conducive to their health. So advocating for a liquid format and not a pill format is something that we should prioritize for sure. And so that would maybe be part of the regulation that we have around this around safer supply. And maybe we don't even do liquid hydromorphone. Maybe we go straight towards fentanyl, right? If people aren't getting touched by hydromorphone. So I mean, again, like I think there's room to move on this. As he had pointed out, we need to talk about what's the best way to move this forward, as opposed to not doing it at all or going full on in. There is some profiteering happening among certain pharmacies that are just dedicated to this population group. For better or for worse. I think some of it is reasonable because methadone needs to be daily witnessed to a certain extent in the very beginning. And people are making a lot of profits off of that. But buprenorphine especially doesn't need to be witnessed in terms of its dosing. We should be giving carries for it right off the bat, and people should have like a month's worth of supply right off the bat. I did some stuff in Boston for a while, and we were giving people 4 months of carries if they were experiencing homelessness, which we don't do here in Alberta. So, I mean, the whole concept of daily dispensions and charging for that is huge profits for a lot of groups. And so, for example, I do hear stories in Edmonton and in Calgary with clients driving numerous kilometers to reach these certain pharmacies to get their daily dose of OAT, opioid agonist treatment. And some of them get paid for this as well, funny enough. They'll talk about how they get paid because the pharmacy will take a bit of the profit and they'll give the client some of the profit. Now, this isn't always that bad because some of these clients are incredibly poor and have incredible financial strain. So for them to make the effort to get a cut of this, I can kind of understand that. But at the same time, those pharmacies are racking in millions and millions of dollars. So if they're if they're if they're unfortunately trying to make buck off of a safer supply, that's probably not the right way to do this. And so one of the ways I think we can move forward with a lot of this is having pharmacies that are government operated and run, to be honest with you, and or not for profit, right? And working with community agencies that deal with this, harm reduction agencies that run their own pharmacies as part of it. I think that's kind of the way to go. I know a lot of people are suspicious of the government, so fair enough. But yeah, if it's done for the not-for-profit organizations, if it's done for people who are organizations who work with this population, shelter groups, etc., I think it can be done appropriately. So I think that's kind of the way to go instead of having these private sectors sort of profit off of this situation. Should I keep moving down my list of
Yeah,
comments?
I mean, you took my question right out of my mouth there because my
Okay.
immediate sort of like rebuttal to Adam's concerns about, well, you have these private pharmacies was like, okay, well, why don't we do government dispensaries? We could save a lot of money. We could mitigate those concerns. The pharmacists that don't want to be involved with these programs don't have to be involved with these programs, and you'd be able to keep a much tighter supply chain. So, plus it would be cheaper because you're not having anyone profit off of it. So everybody wins, but you already addressed that. So yes, please. Next one.
Fair enough. Adam did quote this CAMH study. So there's these CAMH studies that are done, and I have to think about the name of this again. I totally should have written it down. But these are CAMH studies done at Ontario schools. So they go over 200 schools in Ontario, elementary schools and junior high schools and high schools. And they do these surveys with all of the students in these schools. And some of these schools are super big. They're over 2,000 individuals in some of these schools. And so they're super massive. And he talked about how there was an increase in overall non-prescription opioid use among certain demographics. So, for example, in 2019, about 11% or 11% of students were using prescription opioids. And then it increased to about 22% for kids in grades 7 to 19 the year after, is I think was what he was mentioning. And I kind of looked through the results, and indeed there was a huge spike. So between 2021, there was 13%. I saw 2023 was 22%. And so Adam was right on that there was an increase in overall prescription opioid use amongst youth in general. Now, the thing that I think is a bit of a stretch is that attributable to safe supply? And so and that's the part I don't know intensively about. So like safer supply programs, they're limited in scope. Many of them are in of course London, Ontario. There's some in Toronto, but these are looking at schools all across Ontario. And so to correlate that increase in prescription opioid use with safer supply, I think is a bit of a stretch. Not to say that we shouldn't look into it, not to say that isn't possible. So it is definitely within the realm of possibility for sure. But is it attributable to that? No, it's I wouldn't say it's you can actually pin it on that. We need to definitely look into it though. So Adam brings a good point. Like, if we don't see what if there is a concern of a potential correlation, maybe it's something we need to look into and examine a bit more. But to definitively say, and I don't think he was necessarily definitively saying it, although at times I felt like he was implying it. But to correlate the two together is a bit of a stretch, and I would be careful when you do this. And this is with science in general, right? Correlation doesn't necessarily mean causation.
Well, and the other
And
question that I had with that, if I can just jump in for a sec, is, I go back to the story that I referenced during the conversation about Cassie, which was a fake name, so I'm not doing anything bad. But Cassie was talking about the fact that she considers herself to be a prescription opioid user. She's a younger person out of the Vancouver area. And one of the things that she highlighted was the only time that I've ever overdosed has they've found not hydromorphone in my system. And so, one of the questions that I find myself going back to is if the quality of forgeries of pills is so high that people who are using them regularly aren't able to determine, then okay, so 22%, I think that's the number you said, 22% of high school kids are saying, "Oh yeah, now I've tried these prescription opioids." My immediate reaction is, how do you know? Like, how do these kids know that what they're trying is actually commercial grade pharmaceuticals, and how much of it is organized crime going, hey, kids will buy this stuff? Those to me seem to be two very different conversations, and it's that nuance piece that my concern with the way that Adam was presenting it is he was presenting it as if this is the only possible explanation. And I know people who have Coach bags that aren't Coach bags, so eh, maybe not.
Cool. Yeah, and I agree. There could be concerns that it could be fake, but the thing that I think is actually happening more so, and this is based off of previous data that we've seen in the past, is that the vast majority of youth get their opioids from family and friends, and they kind of steal it as well. Like I got to say, that's kind of how it happens. So I'm hard pressed to believe that they're getting it from organized crime syndicates.
Okay.
Not to say it's not possible, but it is possible, of course, right? Any of this is possible. But the likelihood of that is, I think, lesser than people stealing it from friends and family.
Is
If that
there
makes sense.
This goes back to one of the concerns that's been raised throughout this conversation, and I think it's a tricky needle to thread. Um, does that tie back to concerns about overprescribing?
Yeah, it can. Yeah, we need to definitely be careful. I do think that we've clamped down as a service sector a lot on overprescribing. I do think that physicians have been like we are monitored for prescribing practices in Alberta, for example, and so yeah, I think we're a lot more careful. That being said, not everyone is. A lot of people do prescribe these medications for pain and chronic pain. We're moving away from prescribing these opioids for chronic pain. A lot of the evidence shows that prescribing opioids for chronic pain isn't exactly the ideal way of prescribing this. It doesn't actually help with chronic pain, and there's a whole plethora of other medications that we should be prioritizing before opioids. So, and the science kind of follows that. There's like this trial called the SPACE trial that demonstrated that more than 3 months worth of opioids actually increases someone's pain if they have chronic pain concerns. So I think we need to kind of, we definitely need to pull back. We need to be more careful, and we need to be much more cognizant that opioids can get diverted in general. Which I
Yeah.
think, sorry. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I mean, the fact that, Adam came up with, oh, the pills must be coming from diverted safer supply. And I came up with, or it's organized crime. And you came up with, well, actually, odds are they're just stealing it from friends and family. That to me highlights the fact that, you can speculate as to possible things as much as you like, but in the absence of evidence, correlation does not equal causation.
Mhm. No, totally. And I got to say though, the one thing I will point out is that a lot of these facts I'm talking about are Adam's facts, because Adam did have a lot of facts throughout the entirety of the segment. He was throwing out more facts than anybody else. So it might sound very Adam heavy, but that's just because he came prepared. You could tell that he came
Oh,
prepared
no
for this
question.
conversation.
Yeah.
he was ready to debate, and he had all of his, his stats right in front of him. So that's again, totally understandable. Um, so another thing that he brought up was some of Sharon Koivu's research that she's done around pills and causing some infection concerns, and that is fair, as you had mentioned as well, Nate, that there was we see people crushing stuff all the time, misusing prescription stuff all the time. It's not anything new. But we could still do a better job. So his point was taken in that, and I think that if we were to prescribe safe supply, using liquid hydromorphone would be the way to go, as opposed to pill form dilaudid. And so, point well taken. I think from a prescriber's perspective, on my end, if I was going to do safe supply, that's probably the way I would go too. And if I was supposed to use dilaudid, I would go with liquid dilaudid. And that's what we do at these IO clinics, these intravenous opioid agonist treatment clinics. So yeah, very, very much points taken on his end. And I think if I was to sort of summarize the way I look at Adam's comments in general, I reading through a lot of his work in the past, I think Adam's evolved, if I may. I think, and I mean, I shouldn't speak on Adam's behalf because he was here before, and I haven't really directly spoken with him ever, except for once at a conference. I do think that maybe initially he was anti-safe supply. But now I think, much like we kind of spoke about before, he's reached this point of how to do safe supply appropriately and what guardrails do we need to have up. And I think he's teetering on that side of things. And I don't know if you got that perspective as well when you were listening to him. And talking to others as well within conservative circles, I can see them kind of moving the dial as well, that they're much more open to the idea of safe supply, provided that there's guardrails up. I'm going to pause there before I move into what those guardrails should be. But what are your thoughts?
I mean, I think you're hitting on something there because I think one of the bigger parts of the conversation, and this is where I think it may depend a little bit on the day when you talk to Adam, because I've had a couple of conversations with him now, and they've been on different days, and his position has varied somewhat. So I think it might depend a little bit on the day, but I think that the big thing that I took away from the conversation with Adam and Guy is, um, I think that there are some legitimate concerns that exist in regards to how safer supply is implemented. Um, I think that there are some, there's sort of the idealistic, we should legalize everything. We should make everything available to everyone all at once. And while there are arguments for that, I think there is the reality of, well, you could do that and you'd probably save a boatload of lives, but there's going to be a whole bunch of people who lose their fucking minds, pardon my language. And the pushback is going to shut that down very, very quickly. So I think that the expression, uh politics is the hard boring, the long boring, slow boring. Politics is the slow boring of hard boards. And I think that because this is a policy piece that has unfortunately been politicized, I think personally it should just be all driven by evidence, and the politicians should say, oh, it's the evidence. But it has been politicized. There's no putting that particular toothpaste back in the tube. But I think that there are there's a spectrum there. So we don't have to go, we're going to legalize everything all at once tomorrow. I think we can say, hey, you know what? We need to save people's lives. Safe supply is one of the many tools that we can use to save people's lives. But even as you were speaking earlier, you were talking about the people who go to pharmacies and then they split the dispensing fee, because they're going to a farther away pharmacy. That pharmacist gets to take the dispensing fee. Hooray, rena, rena, rena. When you said that, my immediate reaction was, oh, so there's a poverty problem. And that to me goes back to the underlying themes of, I really believe that safer supply is a bridge until you can address the underlying social issues that are, and individual issues that are driving people to use these substances to begin with. Um, so I think that the more that people who recognize the broad value of safer supply are able to mitigate the fears um, of folks like Adam and say, yeah, you know what? Okay, so maybe we don't do pills. Maybe we do the liquid methadone. That's okay. If that gets you on side, cool beans. Um, But I think that there's also, one of the concerns that I have about this conversation is I think that there's a lot of people who have realized, oh, I can get some airtime with this. I can get some attention with this. I can make people afraid. I can make people scared. And I'm not saying that that's what Adam does all the time. I think some of the time, some of his writing, some of his social media, that's my personal interpretation. There's certainly days where he's going for the clicks, and there's certainly other organizations and pundits who do that, and I think that's the really unfortunate part because if you're using issues like this to advance your personal profile as opposed to advancing the issue, um, people are still dying while you're doing that. And so if we could get everybody to sit down at a table and go, okay, there's good evidence for safer supply, let's do it. What's the safest way to do it? What are the guardrails that we need to have in place and have everybody agree on those over a weekend, ideally? That would be fantastic. I think that that would be wonderful. And if that means that some of the folks who are advocating for all of the drugs commercially available to everyone all the time have to, eat some frustration. As much as I look at people like Adam and I go, hey, so please stop being hyperbolic because people are dying. Um, I also look at the other extreme end and I go, okay, but if we can make the people not die and have that conversation later, can we do that too? Because the most important thing is the people not dying. And I think if everybody keeps their eyes on that prize and addressing the reasons why people are using in the first place, as opposed to pontificating, as I've just finished doing for I think the better part of 4 minutes now, I I think that we'd actually address the issues. But you were just going to talk about the guardrails, so I'm going to get out of your way.
Yeah, you know what? And I don't know if it's so here's the deal. Like, I mean, and I've gone through a lot of these pieces. So let's talk about that piece that like before we move into the guardrails, that piece about people being on two extremes and getting a lot of airtime from it. And the one thing that I want to state though is that I do believe, and I think you believe this as well, Nate, that we need to have some objectivity around
100%.
this whole situation. And I think on both sides of the spectrum, there isn't any objectivity. So for example, Julian Summers is a researcher out of SFU, and I don't know if you heard about this, but he was prevented from doing research on safe supply. Now, I don't know the full story behind it, but the way that I look at this is why can't he? If he's going to look at this, and yes, he might have a negative tilt and a negative bias towards this, why can't he examine this? On the flip side of things, we've got people who are super pro safe supply, and they are also doing their own examinations, but they don't necessarily have balancing measures. And that's fair too. Like they've got their own perspectives, but we need to have balancing measures as well. And so when I talk to the plethora of my colleagues who are researchers across this field, you keep getting mixed messages from different people. There's people who are like, they don't agree with doing balancing measures because there's a crisis and they don't want to just skew the discussion around safer supply. There's people who are super anti-safe supply and they want to completely derail it. So we just need to have some objectivity here when we evaluate this. And again, we should be allowing researchers, whichever side of the spectrum they're on, to have peer-reviewed evaluations done. It has to go through ethics. It has to go through a process. There has to be some consensus around these values. Ideally, we have a multi-center trial. That's the other thing that we don't have. A lot of these safer supply programs are different from jurisdiction to jurisdiction to jurisdiction. They have different models. I think the time has come that we all pull together and we do a trial, a multi-center trial. Have again these guardrails up and board. We have the balancing measures to look and assess if there's any concerns with diversion, for example, as well. But I think that's where we need to be headed. And so a study and a pilot and a research program is one thing. that helps us understand the situation. Does it help the population who's in the throes of an epidemic where people are dying left, right, and center? Not necessarily. So that's where we all got to move on to something else. And that might be that happy medium we spoke about with safer supply with some guardrails up. And so talking again to some of the people in the conservative side of things, and of course the liberal side of things as well. I mean, I talk to everybody, right? I have conversations because for me this is fascinating. Again, I don't know where I stand with safer supply at this moment, or prescribed alternatives as they call them. But the one thing that I recognize is that there is an opportunity for all of us to come together. So, for example, I do think that IV fentanyl is the way to go for safer supply, in my mind. I do think that we could potentially be prescribing this in a controlled setting. It can be potentially dangerous, as you know. Thank you for clearing up the costings, because I've been told by numerous individuals that it was incredibly expensive.
It's not.
That was what I was told, and that was one of the main barriers for people to have these types of programs. They're talking about sufentanil, fentanyl as these types of compounds. But I think we could potentially look at that as being prescribed, but in a supervised setting, and we need to be innovative with our supervised settings, for example. So this can be done at supervised consumption sets at pharmacies. It can be done maybe virtually with virtual monitors. We don't want to make this a barrier situation which people can't access these services. But at the same time, like dispensing 1 month of Dilaudid or 1 month's worth of fentanyl at a time may not be the most helpful thing to do, and it can be potentially dangerous. And so daily witness, I think, might be the best way to move forward with this. And in fact, some of the studies that have been done around safe supply actually demonstrate this. There was a study that was done out of the British Medical Association, sorry, the BMJ, British Medical Journal, I should say. And what they looked at was they looked at safer supply practices in Vancouver. And what they found was that if individuals were prescribed safer supply 4 or more times during a week, or they were dispensed at 4 times or 4 intervals, there was a 91 or 93% reduction in overall 91% reduction in mortality within that first week, which is huge. And that compounds itself after every week, which is amazing. That is huge. There's a lot of criticism thrown at that study saying that some of these individuals were on OAT at the same time. And that maybe was what was causing the benefit. And I could say, yes, maybe that is what caused the benefit. But that's great. It's great that they were on OAT as well as their safer supply. Both of those probably reduce their risk of mortality. Yes, it's hard to distinguish the safer supply away from the OAT, but the fact that they're doing the two together is definitely positive, and maybe another model that we should be looking at. And so, again, I don't think we should necessarily, dismiss the study altogether. I think that maybe this is a model that we can look at going forward with safer supply. There was another study that was done that was published that sort of looked at BC's overdose rates and compared to Saskatchewan, Manitoba's, especially around safer supplies prescribing and overdose deaths. And it was very hard to do because I think my main criticism for that study, and that study was a negative study that showed that BC had an increased number of opioid overdose deaths and didn't directly attribute to safer supply. When you talk to the authors, they say that they didn't attribute to safer supply, but when you read the article, it kind of reads like that. But my concern is that the drug toxicity in BC is way more than Manitoba and Saskatchewan. Ideally, what they should have done is they should have compared it to Alberta, because probably Alberta has the closest in terms of drug toxicity levels than BC, I should say. I think BC again is over the top in terms of what's going on over there, but Alberta comes as a close second. So I think that there is a way to go forward. I do think that the toxic drug supply is incredibly perilous right now. We can't be advocating for people to use it. We need to find an alternative for this population to use. And maybe that's a model that we can use going forward. And again, talking to some of the conservative circles, it seems like that could be a model that they're willing to accept, as long as there's daily dispensions, daily witness dosing of these compounds, that there's engagement with the population on a regular basis, that there's offers of recovery-oriented supports and social services, which I think we all agreed upon as well, or you guys agreed upon as well in the conversation on the podcast. I mean, that it totally makes sense. And I don't know if that's not necessarily happening. I think most safer supply programs are offering that wraparound service support, as far as I can tell. But it needs to be more of that. And so I'll pause there, and we can move on to mandated treatment and recovery, Alberta, and all other stuff later on. But yeah, what are your thoughts? What do you
I
think
mean,
about that?
I did a little the audience probably won't see it, but I did when you started talking about the importance of peer review, I did a little dance because this is one of the areas that I think that we fall down in the public discussion a lot is that somebody produces a study and it's not peer reviewed. It hasn't been scrutinized and it gets released to the public and people draw a whole bunch of conclusions and it may never be peer reviewed after that point. But if it's a good study and it's done well and it stands up to the scrutiny of peer review, then no harm, no foul. But if it's not a good study and it's released and the peer review goes, what are you talking about? This is hot garbage. Here's everything that you did wrong. That information, he air quoted heavily, is still out in the ether. And this is where, like, I find it mind blowing that the authors of these studies, like it came up in the conversation where Adam talked about a study that had been done, and Guy immediately was like, so is that peer reviewed? And Adam was like, well, not yet. And I don't know why the author of that study isn't going, everybody stop it, stop it, stop it, stop it. Because if it is quality research, if it's quality study, then it's going to withstand anyways. So who cares? And if it's not, if there's mistakes, then while the public may, I heard about this study this one time in the National Post, um, they're going to be making their conversations and their decisions based around information that isn't doesn't have integrity. And that person who wrote that paper, who was maybe waiting for peer review, is now going to get viewed within the research community as like, oh, it's that guy. Um, and so I don't understand why it is that when we have these studies that have conclusions that are questionable, there is not a greater responsibility among the media and journalists to go, oh, that's not peer reviewed. We probably shouldn't talk about it. Like to me, and this is one of my beefs with Adam. He is a columnist. He regularly appears in the National Post. He regularly appears on radio programs. He's a guest host fairly regularly for a major radio station in the Toronto area. He's written in multiple publications. Why is he talking about these things that have not been scrutinized yet? Like how I think back, here's what I'm trying to say. I think back to when I was like 8. I'm not 8 anymore. I'm very far from 8. And I can remember the times that I turn on, we'd be watching the news on TV because there was no internet, and that's how old I am. Um, and there'd be a story about a promising new drug that could potentially be it could be the cure for cancer. This is the silver bullet that we're finally looking for, and there will be no more cancer deaths. And rena. And 30 some odd, maybe 40 years later, we do not have a cure for cancer. We have options for different types of cancers, and it's that sort of like, why are you talking about this? Don't talk about this yet. Um,
Yeah, it happens on all sides of things, though, to be honest with you. Like I hear it from some of my colleagues who tell me that there's tons and tons of evidence for safer supply. And when I ask them about it, and I mean I read the evidence all the time. I can read these journals all the time, right? They quote program descriptions or program evaluations that aren't published yet. These are my own colleagues, by the way. These are like it's physicians who sometimes do this. And you're kind of like, no, you got to stick to the evidence and you have to stick to peer reviewed, and it happens on both sides. Like again, it happens on all sides of things, everything related to science. I feel like this is always the constant thing. I mean, this happened with COVID. People were quoting stuff left, right, and center. And
some
so I
of them
think it's
are
the
the premier of
responsibility.
Alberta now.
Yeah, right. But that's the thing. I think we need to as professionals, no matter what your political convictions are, really try to stick to the truth and the evidence. And I think that's the key here, that we're losing I mean we're losing perspectives on things sometimes because We like, and again, everyone does this on both political sides of the spectrum. We just need to really stick to the evidence and really look at what's the best form of truth and see how we can do better with that, with that information. Also, maybe create better studies as well. It's always a learning process. Sometimes the first study you do is not always the best. You make a subsequent study that's a bit better because you learn from that first study. I mean, the other thing too that I often hear is like it's incredibly going back to safer spot discussion is that it's incredibly hard to measure diversion. How do we do that? What's the best way to do that? It's incredibly difficult. So I can see why some have not been able to do that as of yet, but we have to figure out a mechanism to determine that. If we are really going to get above this situation and get above the criticism that exists around this. And the answer is not looking for it. The answer is we need to look for it. We need to do it a proper way, even though it's hard to do, and we need to come to some consensus in terms of how to do it. And this is for everything. And so, like for example, with cancer drugs, with cardiac medications, we always look for side effects, right? We always look for the downside of things. And that's the way I kind of look at safer supply is that it's like chemotherapy. It can really help a lot of people, and I have met people who it has helped, but it could potentially be problematic as well. And we need to figure out what those are, and then we need to determine which population is best to receive it, and then they should receive it. It's not as it's not a no, but they should not be receiving it. It's not a blanket no. No one in the population should be getting this. It shouldn't be a blanket yes. Everyone should be getting this. We have to figure out a way to determine who's best to receive these types of supports.
Do you think there needs to be a greater awareness among the public um, around the fact that medicine is not static and the treatment of medical conditions is not static? Like I take a look at my time working as a paramedic and the number of things that have gone in vogue, gone out of vogue, and come back again because there's new evidence is stunning. The number of medications. I mean, like take an ACLS course 10 years ago, take an ACLS course now. Whoa, there's been some changes. It is a constant learning thing. I mean, there's medications that I administer to people, uh, and we don't fully understand why they do the things they do. We just know that they do the things they do, and that more often than not has positive effects. So we use those medications. But it's not a concrete, established, this is 100%. We know all of the things about this. It is a constantly evolving thing. And because of that, the solutions and the approaches to complex problems like addictions and mental health are going to be constantly evolving. Like the answer to the opioid crisis and the toxic supply crisis in 5 years is probably going to look very different than the answers that we're talking about today. And that's okay because we're learning as we go. Do you think there needs to be a greater awareness of the public? Do you think that everybody on all sides of these issues needs to sort of say, hey, how about we do the best that we can in the moment that we're in and we try to learn more while we're doing it?
I agree completely. That is exactly what we move forward is we need to create better education around this. And that's science. I think in science classes, we need to talk about how science shifts and changes and new things are discovered and things need to be modified. And we are always learning and growing. And there's multiple different facets to this. And then one of the other things that I love that you mentioned over and over again in the podcast was how there was no silver bullet for this crisis. And so there's multiple different mechanisms to deal with this, and that'll always be shifting over time. We'll get more and more evidence. I mean, the drug supply itself is shifting. It's constantly changing. Like the landscape is always changing, and it's hard to predict what's the cause of one death versus the other. And even in our own jurisdictions, like like just earlier today, I was talking to a bunch of students about the crisis and the different the how it's not a uniform crisis because everyone just thinks it's fentanyl and it's a deadly crisis. But like in Edmonton, 22% of the deaths from 2023 were related to carfentanil in the drug supply. Calgary only had 2%. I mean, those are two huge different numbers, right, between two jurisdictions. Um, I mean, again, and then there's certain benzos that are found in some jurisdictions versus others. Xylazine is not found uniformly everywhere. Again, we're dealing with different types of drugs. It's not a uniform problem necessarily. But some of the solutions might be a bit more broadly encompassed as well. Not to say that it can't be, but such a safer supply. If you had safer supply, you wouldn't have to be dealing with xylazine and benzos and whatnot. But yeah, absolutely. We need to, nothing's a silver bullet. It's always constantly changing. And maybe you'll find a different solution later on down the road. And there again has to be multiple approaches to this. Like enforcement is another piece, right? Like we need to figure out how to deal with the toxic drug supply. We need to stop people from mixing xylazine benzos into the drug supply. How do we do that? Whose responsibility is that? That's definitely enforcement's responsibility, right? I mean, the big fear that I even hear from police officers who I work with, and some of the drug units is that they're always afraid that as soon as they do a drug bust, that the drug supply is going to shift again. It's going to cause a spike in overdoses, and that's always their concern, and that's a legitimate concern for sure. But then, what's the best solution for it? Do we stop doing drug busts? No, we can't do that either, right? I mean, these people are whoever the organized crime ranks are, they're taking advantage of our folks. We need to, and maybe that's the other thing with safer supply is that maybe it cuts them out of the equation, which I think is the way it needs to be in some respects. It needs to be a two-pronged approach. Um, okay, I've blabbed far enough, long enough.
I
Um,
want to, there's still the big, ugly topic. Um, and I'm nervous about this one because I really don't want to be wrong about it. But the province of Alberta is in the next couple of months looking at bringing forward some sort of legislation that will enable forced treatment. Um, I know of no evidence that says, oh, this is a good idea, other than people's feelings and their desire for a greater sense of control of the situation. Um, Adam advocated for it. Guy advocated against it. I'm pretty sure I banged my head into the desk. Dr. Ghosh, what are your thoughts?
this is a very, very tough topic, especially if it's focused on opioids. And the reason for that is like the studies around the opioids and the mandated treatment piece, and I've looked through this over and over again. In fact, I've debated others about this as well. Is that the evidence isn't there isn't really proper evidence for this in general, first and foremost. But overall, when we've looked at forced treatment for all substances, whether it's alcohol, methamphetamine use, and then also voluntary treatment, the outcomes are typically equivalent, funny enough. And people use they use arguments for and against using the same data. So, for example, they're saying that if the data is equivalent, that means that we should be forcing everyone to treatment because it's better than just leaving them on the side. And then the other flip side of the argument is that if we are forcing people to treatment, we're removing their autonomy, removing their own sense of self. We are taking away their rights. And there's huge ethical and legal issues in this perspective. Now, there is some data from Massachusetts that shows that, and they did have forced treatment and mandated treatment there, that demonstrated that there was an increase in population level deaths with forced treatment. So that was there. The problem with some of that data that I hear back from people who are proponents of mandated treatment is that not everyone was forced on OAT, which is what the Alberta's plan is. Some of them were forced off of everything altogether. Abstinence, which is horrible. We know that abstinence can actually increase deaths from opioids if you force people off of their OAT. So they often disclaim that data, saying that that's not necessarily the truth, and that Alberta is not planning to do that. They're not planning to force people off of their opioids or their OAT. They want people to be forced onto OAT, which is a different type of model. All in all, this is actually part of a greater scheme, if you may. It's part of a bigger plan for decriminalization. And what that model of decriminalization is, it's the Portugal model of decrim. Now, Portugal does not have mandated treatment. When you look at the Portugal model of decrim, and it's a different form of decrim. It's not as progressive as Vancouver's or Oregon's model. It's a model that really turns it really sort of pushes for looking at substance use as a health issue as opposed to a criminal justice issue. Um, and that's good. That's definitely positive. And I think that's what the plan is for the Conservatives. They're planning to shift the model away from criminal justice to one of health. And I think that is actually a good thing ultimately, especially with all of the pushback we're getting right now with decrim, with Vancouver and with Oregon, and how they've moved back on that. I can sense there's a lot of hesitancy amongst conservative circles to look at the Portugal model now because of all of that pushback. But I think that might be the model we need to go forward with in some respects. So how does the mandated treatment play into all of this? Is the big question, and that is that they have these dissuasion commissions. So the way the Portugal model works is that if you are caught with any sort of substance on your personal possession with less than 10 days worth, or it's 2 weeks worth, I can't remember exactly which, on your own personal body, you have to go to a dissuasion commission. And within the dissuasion commission, and that commission usually consists of a justice person, a healthcare provider, social worker, they can decide whether or not you go scot-free without any penalties, whether you get a citation and a fine, or if you have to go to treatment, and or whether they suggest treatment. So in Portugal, they suggest treatment. They try to encourage you to go to treatment. And the fines are used as an incentive to go to treatment, or not an incentive, but it's a coercive measure in some respects. So for example, you either pay the fine or you go to treatment, right? That's kind of how it works. And the thing that they did in Portugal, which is somewhat fallen apart now because the more recent reports of the Portugal model is that it's not working anymore, is that it was heavily funded for treatment supports and social supports. And it goes back to the question of poverty that you mentioned earlier, that comment of poverty. They had tons of supports for housing. There was just a lot of supports all in all to lift up the population. And then they've continuously defunded things since the Portugal model got put in place in the early 2000s. So of course it's not working as much anymore as it was at one point in time. There's other criticisms of the Portugal model that did not support harm reduction. For example, they've moved towards supporting harm reduction resources as well. But all in all, the plan that the Alberta government has, as far as I understand it, I could be completely wrong on this because I don't know the full details, is that these commissions will be put in place to force people into treatment if they need to be forced into treatment. And now I've heard different versions of this as well. The ongoing joke I think with me is that people keep telling me that, Monty, knowing your progressive values, you're going to be happy with the legislation once you see it. I've heard this from a few people already, and I don't know what that means exactly. If this means that people, instead of getting prison time because they're caught with substances, or they're caught using substances, or they're caught doing stuff in public, then causing public disruption, are put into treatment as opposed to jail, that could be a positive thing, right? But if this is used as a weapon to essentially indirectly criminalize individuals, that could be a bad thing. And we've seen this happen before. We've seen this in Australia. They had forced mandated treatment, and guess who were the vast majority of people who were getting put into these free treatment facilities? It was their Indigenous Aboriginal populations, right? I'm worried that same thing might happen with our populations as well. Right now, even our prisons, like, I mean, I looked at a recent stat that showed that 50% of females who are incarcerated were Indigenous. A disproportionate amount of our males who are incarcerated are Black Canadians, African Canadians. So we need to be very, very mindful about how we do this. And again, I don't know which way this is going to go, but and I don't know the legislation. I need to, I think the devil's going to be in the details. But it's going to be very, very interesting to see how this goes. So parts of this is reasonable. I think, moving along the Portugal model is better than nothing at all, to be honest. Like, the Portugal model is the way to move forward. And if the Conservatives are open to that, and funny enough, the Conservative parties in Portugal are the ones who implemented this. It was a conservative model. I think that's a great thing. Forced treatment, on the other hand, I don't know. I don't think it's the way to go. I think we should incentivize treatment. We should be paying people to get into treatment, and I think that's a reasonable way to go. In fact, like, as I said, Guy and I are friends. We wrote a piece on this about how incentivizing treatment is probably a better way of moving forward and helps motivate people to get into treatment than forcing them into treatment. You incentivize them to, and you motivate them to spend time. And the way this would look is that if someone is offered an incentive, say $20 a day, they will go into treatment and they will only get paid that money until after they finish their treatment program. And maybe we can have other hooks on it too that the conservatives will be happy about. Maybe you have to say you have to be in supports, community supports for 3 months thereafter, showing and demonstrate they're not using substances. I think a lot of conservatives will buy into that model. Um, and honestly, Nate, the reason why I keep speaking about conservatives is because this is the reality that we live in right now. We live in a reality in our province where it's a conservative province. And in fact, it might be a conservative country in the near future. And the way that I look at public policy is that we have to move along the lines of which windows of opportunity are open. And we have to kind of align with figure out how best to align with certain values. And I think this is the way to move forward, given the particular circumstance that we're in right now, in this province and in this country, especially with the pushback from BC and Oregon. Um, so I mean, that's it in a nutshell, I guess. But I do think that mandate treatment can be very problematic. I think that I would personally not go down that path. I would go down to the path of incentivization of some way or form. I think that it would be a mistake to go down this path. And I think if we had the right amount of supports, and I've heard this from conservatives as well, if we had the right amount of treatment facilities, trauma supports, wellness supports, housing supports as well. We may not need to go down this whole path of mandated treatment or the Compassionate Care Act. So let's work on that first. Let's work on getting all those pieces up to par. And then if nothing else is working, then maybe go down that other path and see it. And we have to evaluate. That's the other thing too. If the Alberta government's going to do this, and sounds like they are, we need to have objective evaluation of it. Much like safer supply, there was all these questions about whether or not it's being properly evaluated. We need to properly evaluate the Compassionate Care Act as well. It needs to be done in an objective way. It needs to be looking at balancing measures as well. Is it causing harm to people? Because it could be potentially causing harm to individuals. Um, and I know it's a struggle for a lot of people around the Compassionate Care Act. I have moms who call me all the time who are like, Monty, you don't have kids. If you had a kid who had substance use concern, would you not force them into treatment? What would you do in that situation? And when you've done everything you could for your child and there's nothing else left to do, would you not force them into treatment? And I'm like, oh, I'm fortunate that I'm not in that situation, but I hear them, I hear their voices, right? I've also got on the flip side of things, I've got moms who tell me that they would never do that, and that mandated treatment has hurt and harmed their children, especially with the PCHAD rules that we have here in Alberta. It's hard. I've had families that I've seen move across the country to come to Alberta just to get their kids into PCHAD. Um, so that's interesting, right? Because they want their kids to be forced into addiction treatment, for better for worse. And it's so, I mean, again, I don't know. I know it's incredibly complicated. It's very nuanced. There's a lot of emotions involved, especially when it involves family members, for instance. But I guess the devil's going to be in the details when we see the legislation.
I got a couple things I want to tease out of what you said there because I had some questions. I was making notes. The Massachusetts data, if I am recalling the same study that I think you're referencing, it's 2.2 times higher risk of death coming out of mandated treatment as opposed to, which is double. That's not great. Um, but even if you look at that, 2.2 times, it's because only some of them weren't on the islet. Um, okay, so we're only talking about opiates then? Is my immediate reaction. Because if, I think about the people who are the social disorder ones, they're a danger to themselves and others. We're not talking about opioid users. Those are not the people who are downtown behaving extremely erratically. Those are the ones who are nodding and sleeping. That's what opiate users are. So we're talking about the sympathomimetic, the methamphetamines, probably more than anything, maybe a little bit of cocaine, although I don't know if that's still cool. But that argument goes away for me right there because if we're only talking about forced treatment for opioid users, then we're talking about the people who aren't being the public disruptors. So what are we talking? It gets very, like you said, it gets very, very complicated very quickly. But to me, I mean, the incentivized stuff that you were talking about there, I can see value in that. Where I get squirrely, and this is what I'm hoping you can tell me if I'm wrong or right or on this right track, or where I get squirrely is people say things like, and I've heard Adam say this, things like, well, if you go into treatment and you complete treatment, then we'll get you housing. Dandy Williams, Minister of Drinking Beers in the legislature, has said the same thing. If you go into treatment and you're successful, then we'll get you housing, then we'll get you social supports. And that to me seems to be an extraordinarily fraught and problematic way, because now you're saying, you know, I've heard numbers saying that the recidivism is the wrong word, relapse rate for treatment ranges anywhere from 2 to 7 times a person's going to have to go to treatment if they're part of the 50% that is fortunate enough to achieve complete recovery, or abstinence-based recovery, I should say. So 50% of the population is going to have a really hard go of this for a whole lot of reasons. And if you're opening the conversation by saying we're only coming for the 50% that after a couple of runs of treatment will be able to go entirely abstinent, then the message that you're sending is, and those other 50% are worthless. We don't care. You can die. And that to me is, like, I look at, there's programs in Calgary that I've crossed paths with where uh, people are living in harm reduction settings where they're able to access housing and they're able to continue to, and other supports, and they're able to still use their substance of choice. And the upward trajectory for those people is really, really inspiring. And so where I worry with this mandated treatment piece, like, I think that most people in this day and age have probably had somebody in their universe who has uh, suffered negative effects because of somebody they know who was grappling with addiction. Um, And I think that most people will be able to say, I wish there was something I could do. I wish there was some sort of, everybody wants to have everything be good, but that doesn't give you the right to just assert control over other people. And this is what I was trying to convey to Adam in the conversation is when it comes down to questions of competency, that's really complicated. And it's the revocation of charter rights. And to say to a person who is already, presumably, if you're going to be responsible, I would argue, you're going to treat this person, you're going to presume that there's some trauma there. To say to that person, hey, um, you've got some trauma and you're using the drugs. We're going to traumatize you more. We're going to take away your self of control more, and get better or else, to me just seems like a, how can you, like, I don't understand how anyone can imagine that that's going to work. And I don't know if it's because the conversation hasn't been had of, do you realize what this is? Like, if we're just going to say it has nothing to do with competency from a medical standpoint, and it is a medical determination, if we're just going to say we don't like what you're doing, um, I can clear half the traffic on Deerfoot out right away, because there's a lot of people who drive on Deerfoot in ways that I don't like. It negatively impacts me. And if we're just going to go with subjective measures of what's the negative impact as opposed to what the medical standards are and what the legal standards are, I can clear Deerfoot. I mean, am I?
So, sorry. No,
No,
you're
go ahead.
right.
I'm like,
So
this is where I want your response.
I think you're right. So I'm worried about re-traumatizing this patient population. We already have a history of forcing people to residential schools. We know that those who are, I don't want to discriminate or stigmatize, but like about 30% of our, and then really a lot of this is targeted, and I'll just say this straight out. A lot of this is around public safety concerns and the perception of public safety, right? This is where this really stems to, especially around our populations experiencing homelessness. And unfortunately, 30% of the population that is experiencing homelessness are Indigenous populations. And I am worried that if we are targeting this population group, especially if we're targeting this population group, and with that history and that legacy of residential schools, we will be harming them even more than we've ever had before. And I am super concerned about that. Now, the other thing that I'm worried about is that, as you mentioned, methamphetamine seems to be the main reason why we're having so much public disruption. We don't have a good treatment for methamphetamine use. Like, so what are we going to be treating them with? Like, I don't quite get that. But that's the part that I'm not too sure about. Now, I've heard from others that if someone shows up with 17 or 18 opioid overdose events or drug poisoning events, that's when they're really going to try to push them to get onto OAT, force them to get onto Sublocade. Now, Sublocade is an injectable OAT. People call it a game changer in terms of getting people to forced treatment. But it's not that easy to do. You have to like literally pin someone down, expose their abdomen, inject them subcutaneously. It's not it can be a painful procedure. Like, how are we going to do this practically for mandated treatment? I guess we'll have to sedate them. Like, I mean, I don't know how this is going to go otherwise if we're going to be forcing people onto Sublocade unless they willingly get onto Sublocade. The other piece to all of this is, and this is where I like housing is a form of treatment. And this is the thing that I keep teaching others around me, my students around me. We joke around that if someone comes into if someone has is experiencing homelessness and they have hemoglobin A1C, that is a measure of diabetes of 8, and they have high blood pressure, and it's and we're having troubles managing it. What should we do first? And my students will always tell me we should get them on these meds or that med, and whatnot. It's like, no, just get them housing. Get them housing, get them proper meals, stop them, help them out with food so that they don't have to, and their food security issues, because we don't want them to go scrambling through garbage bins, grabbing whatever they can eat. Like, if you have those measures in place, their blood pressure will go down, their A1C will go down. They're going to be much more stable. Now, with crystal meth in particular, for example, housing is a form of treatment. A lot of my patients will tell me the reason that they're using crystal meth in the first place is because they want to stay awake all night long, to protect their belongings, to protect their things, to protect their stuff. And so if you were able to get them housing and provide them with basic security, that will reduce concerns altogether. Now, I see that housing has to be tailored towards certain populations. We need to have harm reduction housing first and foremost for this population group, but that could be a pathway towards their own recovery. So, for example, if they're using crystal meth a lot, we can demonstrate a reduction in overall crystal meth use when they actually have housing. We have reductions in overall drug use when people have appropriate housing as well. Taking care of their basic necessities on the Maslow's hierarchy of needs is the key thing we need to do for this population first before we tackle anything else. So to say that we need to we will get people housing after they finish treatment is not the way to go. We need to get them housing right away if we can. Now, often what happens is people go into treatment first, and as they're waiting and going through treatment, that's when we try to isolate and not isolate, but to try to locate housing for them. It takes time. It's not easy. There's a huge wait list. So treatment can be a bridging measure, but it shouldn't be, there shouldn't be any conditions placed on housing, really. If it's absence-based housing, maybe, like I can understand that. I have a lot of clients who are trying to be off of illicit street stuff, and they find it very triggering if they see someone drinking, for example, in the house that they're in or the building that they're in. And so there's dedicated buildings that are geared towards abstinence. Again, not for opioids, of course, but I can see that as being an issue. But again, it should not be a precondition for finishing treatment. Yeah, and I don't know if most conservatives feel that way either. When I talk to those circles, I don't think they see that as being one thing over the other. But yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I mean, like to me, at the end of the day, one of the things that I learned from a harm reduction group that we did an episode with, the street cats, there was a phrase that one of them said that I immediately was like, oh my God, we use this. And it has to do with, in some of the suicide prevention courses that I've done, one of the big questions that we ask is, okay, how do I get you safe? Well, how do we come up with a plan where we can get you safe for the next period of time? And to look at anybody who's in a houseless or a homeless situation and to not immediately assume that they are in some form of crisis just by nature of the fact that they're living on the streets. I mean, that's a crisis. I wouldn't want to do that. And to not have the first question be, how can I make you safe? How do we get you safe? Uh, is to me a failure of some sorts. I mean, there's certainly people who experience, especially with the methamphetamine stuff. I mean, that's a whole other that there's a reason why I didn't want to get into that with the Adam and Guy conversation because the physiological impacts of that class of drugs versus opioids, hypoxic brain injury aside, is way different. But at the end of the day, if you're dealing with a person who is attached to reality, who would meet the medical standards of competency, um, to not have that whole conversation being guided by the principle of how do we make you safe, is it to me it's just we're starting from when we talk about the forced treatment or when we talk about you if you go into treatment and you're successful you'll get housing. That to me is again it's just we're not talking about that person's problem. This is what it is. Here we go. Here's my line. If we're talking about forced treatment, if we're talking about mandated treatment, if we're talking about using housing as bait, we're not talking about solving that person's problem. We're talking about solving ours. And that's what makes me crazy. So
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, I completely agree.
there's my line drop for the night. Um, is there anything else, any other topics? Because we finished with the forced treatment in the conversation with Adam and Guy. Uh, and um, at that point, we were well over the committed time, as I think we are with this episode. But is there anything else you want people to hear? Is there anything else you want people to know? Is there anything else you want to highlight? Uh, Floor is yours.
I mean, I would, I don't know if we have time for this, but
We have as
I
much
do
time
think
as you need.
really well. I mean, like, I mean, for me, it's the decrypt thing. I'm pretty disappointed with the way the decrypt kind of rolled back. Um, and I think it can still be done. And I want people to not give up on the idea. It needs to be done appropriately. There was a lot of mess associated with it. I think we all need to be very practical with it. So like, for example, one of the concerns that happened in British Columbia, for example, was that we had decrim there, and there was some concerns of public disruption that was occurring. Police weren't sure how to enforce public substance use rules. They weren't sure if they could enforce them or not. Of course, they could enforce them. There was need to be greater education around that. But when the government of BC tried to implement some greater policy around that piece in particular, there was pushback from advocates who fought hard that, and I can see their point that if you're not allowing people to use in public spaces, there's a higher risk of them overdosing if they're using alone on their own, right? So I get that perspective. But again, you need to have some sort of balance with that too, right? Maybe that's only with opioids and not with methamphetamines, but then how do you distinguish that too? That's the other question. But I mean, and right, like I mean, we can in some respects, but sometimes people are using both. And so it is really, really hard to say that to one group that you can use in public and the other group that you can't use in public, right? It's just really, really hard to do. But what did the government do because of the advocacy piece and them taking this to the courts and the court deciding that BC can enforce public safety laws or public nuisance laws? Was that the BC government pulled the entire thing all out altogether, right? That was essentially what happened. And I didn't think that was the way that we needed to go forward with this. Like I do think that there's again a place for this, and we need to try this again. But maybe it does come along the lines of the more conservative model to start off with before we move towards more progressive models. Um, So I'm not giving up hope yet, is what I'm saying. I do think that this is where we need to go in the future. We need to treat this as a health issue. But and we need to move uniformly with that. And I think the conservatives have a plan for that, and let's roll with it for now, right? Let's just see how this goes. Because I think that's the first piece to this is like a step-by-step progression, right? You can't turn a big ship in one go. It takes, it takes a while. So so yeah, I mean that's my piece on decrim. There's so many other things we can talk about, Nate. We can save them for another time, but I appreciate the opportunity to chat today.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to chat over the course, a little inside baseball, over the course of two separate days because we did first half and then second half because you had to save lives and junk. But
As they
I really do appreciate you taking the time to have this conversation and provide some context and some factual information on this. And I just want to go back to the idea that I think that I don't think that Guy, sorry, not Guy. I don't think that Adam wants to see people die. I don't think that Pierre Polyev wants to see people die. I don't think Danielle Smith wants to see people die. I think I don't think Dan Williams wants to see people die. I don't think any of those people want that. I think what they want is a sense of control. And I think that they lack the background and the context and the information to understand that there are ways to restore peace without having to inflict control. And those are two very, very different things. And I really, really hope that the conversation around the managing and addressing the toxic supply, managing and addressing the mental health crisis, managing and addressing the failure of the social safety net. I really, really hope that those conversations can somehow, I don't know how, be somewhat depolarized because those are all things that can be measured and addressed with empirical evidence. And if we do that instead of, I don't like seeing that person, um, then I think we'll get a whole lot farther because if we rely on how it makes me feel as opposed to, and I think I said this earlier in the conversation, like, oh, you feel unsafe? I don't care. Um, like if you're, I feel unsafe on a roller coaster. Does that mean that all roller coasters should be removed from the face of the earth? Of course not. So if you feel unsafe around a houseless person or a homeless person or somebody who's using drugs, there's lots of ways for you to remove yourself from that situation. But to say that they have to be removed is, to me, missing the entire point. So, thank you so much for all of your time. Thank you so much for the work that you do. And I hope that we can have more. I would love to have you back when the legislation that I just am dreading is introduced, to get your response for what you think of it.
Yeah, no, sounds good. Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing it.
I am scared.
Yeah, I am too, but I've been assured by a few people that it would be reasonable. And again, that they know who I am and they know my values, and the fact that they're saying to me that I think it'll be reasonable is somewhat positive, I guess. But I'm still skeptical. Like I I won't believe until I see it. You know what I'm saying? And I'm
Well,
not gonna get my hopes up, which means it's unreasonable until I see it. Yeah.
I won't believe it until the experts like you say, yeah, it's actually not that bad because I'm not either
Well,
an addictions expert or a
I,
physician or
And the conservatives are smart. Like I know that if it's really bad, that this is going to go to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court's going to strike it down. And I don't think that's a battle that they want to go for, really. And so I'm almost certain that they're whatever they're drafting, there's a lot of intention behind it. Because it's just going to be a waste of everyone's time and effort and money if this just goes to the Supreme Court and gets shut down, right? Now, the one thing they haven't done is they haven't done any consulting with any of the public or any of the stakeholder groups. So I don't know if that's, like, so, but again, like, I think, they're smart people. And the one thing I will give Dan Williams, I'll give the entire Conservative Party here, the UCP party here, is that they know their stuff. They know what they're advocating for. They're incredibly intelligent. Now they'll stick to their guns around certain things, their philosophies, and they do play games. I'll say that. So, like, for example, like, they'll increase funding towards supervised consumption services, but publicly denounce them. Like, this is a common tactic that we've seen them use over and over and over again, which is unfortunate because it misinforms the public, and we need to have unified perspectives on on things, right? Especially things that are just basic things that we need to, like, especially, well, not, I should say basic things, but there's things that are controversial that we need to be very clear on, I think, is what I'm trying to say here. And so having mixed messages from the Conservative Party, where they're privately behind the scenes funding more harm reduction supports, funding more naloxone distribution kits, and then yet publicly denouncing harm reduction, it just does not make sense. And there's so much politics involved. Like, Nate, we can maybe off the air we can talk about this, but both parties, I'll say that there's a lot of games being played by along all sides of things. Like, the city of Calgary has played games around this as well, around the supervised consumption side. The city of Red Deer has played games around this too, and the city of Edmonton. We think that they're very progressive city. We have progressive city leadership, uh, but I don't know.
I mean, I'll just go
Um,
back to the interviews that I had with the NDP leadership candidates. I think there were two, one of whom dropped out, who were willing to say, yes, I will pursue safe supply, the or safer supply. The other ones were all like, well, I'm not convinced. I have to see the data. I have to see the things. We got to have conversations. Rana. So even like the progressives are maybe not as progressive as we like to tell ourselves.
I think they're being safe, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing because I mean, the evidence is still growing for this. I would probably say the same thing too if I was being asked, if I was going to put safer supply legislation in, I'll be like, we need to be very careful and thoughtful about it because, again, with these guardrails, right? But even then, there's things that are not as controversial, like supervised consumption sites. This is not controversial at all, yet it was very much in my perspective, the city of Calgary that pushed back on getting it up and running in other sites, in other just parts of the city. The city of Red Deer, we heard their city council denounce them as well, right? But yet it was behind the scenes the UCP that were pushing it forward. So I mean, what is this about, right? Like, what's going on here? Politics is messy.
Don't I know it? Dr. Ghosh, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to chat. And I hope you have an excellent weekend.
Thank you. You too. Take care, Nate. Thanks again for having me.
And that's it for another episode of The Breakdown. As always, if you appreciate the kind of content that we're trying to produce here, we would love nothing more than if you thought about signing up to be one of our Patreon sponsors at www.patreon.com/thebreakdownab, where for just the price of a fancy cup of coffee a month, you can help us continue to produce this kind of content. Whether you're listening to the audio version of the podcast, in which case, maybe leave a review and a rating, or whether you're watching it on one of our streaming platforms, we want to say a big thank you to everybody who is part of the Breakdown's audience. And as always, take care of each other and keep the conversation going.